Stigma is when society looks down on you because of a disease or condition that you have and punishes you for having that. So, for example, you can be stigmatized for, having a disease, and society doesn't want to see it or doesn't want to treat you well because it's a certain kind of disease and not another kind that's more acceptable, and they keep resources from you and give it to people who have diseases that are better liked than the one that you have. I'm being interviewed today because I was one of the first people to study the stigma of migraine. My discovery was that there's a lot of stigma associated with migraine and that it tracks with a disability. So if somebody has migraine and they behave nicely and they don't let anybody know that they have migraine, society doesn't think anything of them. But if they have migraine with disability, they don't show up at work, or they don't show up at school, or they don't perform well, they get punished for that. They get looked down upon for that. And it's a very strong effect. As bad as it is for epilepsy, which is a brain disease with a notorious history of being stigmatized. My studies have been confirmed with studies where they talk to people who don't have migraine. And it's exactly correct. People with migraine report being stigmatized. People who don't have migraine report looking down on people who have migraine with disability. People who have migraine with disability are portrayed, in the media and the literature, and in people's minds in a very negative way that I think is very wrong and unfair. The Coalition for Headache and Migraine Patients, CHAMP, set up the Stigma Committee, as an important part of our mission was to reduce stigma. I'm an adult neurologist. At the first meeting, we sat down and we said, what are we going to do to reduce stigma? And all the migraine patients in the room said kids. We've got to work on kids. That's where it starts. They were right, and they convinced me almost immediately that this is the best approach we can do to changing attitudes about stigma is to reach the kids and their parents and perhaps their teachers. It's been extraordinary what we've been able to accomplish, I think. And so many times since I've been looking for it, I've heard the story, my teacher wouldn't let me leave the room and I threw up in front of the class, or I missed an appointment or an assignment, and I wasn't allowed to make it up, and I was humiliated in front of the class because of the migraine, or the parents making the kids go to school, and prolonging, their suffering and their migraine. And you had to be exposed to all those triggers in that environment, which, a busy, noisy, bright room with lots of activity is not exactly the best place to heal from a bad migraine attack. That's how I got involved in this. That's the story of stigma and migraine, and why we think it's so important to address this with kids. There are 3 types of stigma that can negatively affect people and kids who have migraine disease. One is policies or school rules, I think, are what we're talking about here. Kids being able to go to the nurses and lie down, or sit at the back of the class and put their head down or not. Simple rules like that you would never put someone who might have a different disease, who has a fever, can measure that, and they get to lie down and get attention and so forth, and take a Tylenol, whatever happens. Doesn't happen a lot or very often for kids and adults with migraine. One is sort of just the general attitudes in society. People have to hear that their disease is not important, or something they just have to toughen up and deal with better than they're actually dealing with. And then the worst kind of stigma that I think affects people the most is when the people with the disease itself come to believe it, and that's called internalized stigma. If you hear through a whole lifetime, you're just not tough enough, and you should be able to handle this, or, just go to school and do the best you can. Eventually, people come to believe that about themselves. And that's the worst of all. And that's associated with depression, low self-esteem. Is just, incredibly bad for somebody's physical and psychological health. One thing is that kids with migraine are likely, or than not, are more likely than kids who don't have migraine have parents with migraine. And they themselves are more likely to have kids with migraine. So if they learn, ways to handle it and not develop self-stigma and find, healthy, appropriate ways of coping and living their best lives with migraine. And I'm not an advocate of not going to school for every minor twinge that crosses your forehead, but finding healthy ways that they get the best education and socialization despite their migraine, leave the playing field when it's really not appropriate for them to stay there. If we can teach them that, kids will teach their parents and their friends, and they won't develop that terrible self-stigma. And if we just treat this matter-of-factly, do the best job we can, give them some accommodations, help them get through their disease and succeed, they'll turn out just great. Eliminating stigma would be amazing. Most of my adult patients who have migraine have had at least one negative interaction with doctors who hold the same stigma that the rest of society has. But the problem is when doctors are stigmatizing, it's worse. The same message, but somebody who can really hurt you and make you feel bad about yourself. I'd like to see less stigma everywhere, but particularly in doctors. Obviously, parents stigmatizing kids is a huge problem if that's going on. I'm not saying it always does, but at least sometimes it does. It's bad coming from teachers, more than the guy driving the ice cream truck. How do you quantify, the impact of stigma? You can't. But if you asked me, I would say a third. Like just by reducing the stigma of migraine, you get rid of about a third of the bad part of migraine disease. It's a really significant, important part and an injury to at least my patients who have migraine disease.